Millions are homeless and unemployed. Our economy lies in ruins. Negotiations on the dismantling of apartheid will have to address the overwhelming demands of our people for a democratic, non-racial, and unitary South Africa.
Nelson Mandela, also known as Tata or Madiba, who is known for being the father of modern South Africa, was the catalyst in ending the apartheid rule over South Africa, an era that spanned over a large portion of the 20th century and one of the worst times in South Africa's history. To better understand how it played out, we will dive into what is known as South African Townships by Martin Gannon. This is a township in South Africa. It's also known today as a location where non-whites at the time were forced to live when apartheid was enforced in 1948. Here you would find enclosed communities that were separated from the white people, where people either had limited or no access to electricity, fresh water in their dwelling, had surrounded dirt streets, and little to no law enforcement. To understand this, we need to go back to the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, present-day Afrikaners are actually Dutch descent, and they developed a new language in this time called Afrikaans, which is derived largely from Dutch and Flemish. Now, Afrikaners who took power post-World War II started the process of entrenching the subordination of the African, colored, and Indian population of South Africa, even though the separation was universally condemned by the other nations. Now, to understand South Africa and its unique or distinctive features, it's important to understand its townships and homeland systems, which is what stemmed into apartheid in 1948, even when restrictions started a little earlier, around the beginning of the 20th century. Since the sheer competition for better jobs motivated such restrictions, saving the better jobs for the Afrikaans. This went all the way up until 1992, where reforms were initiated by then President F.W. de Klerk in 1990, with South Africa holding its first democratic election, with ANC leader Nelson Mandela winning the majority vote and becoming president. So, moving to an insider's view of the historical background of this phenomena. Until the 19th century, the South African economy was a subsistence economy, with a large percentage of the economy dependent on agriculture for a living. It's important to note that the African communities had a firmly established and thriving agrarian society. The prosperous farmlands were all well organized under the kings and their paramount chiefs. With the arrival of the English and the Dutch, with their superior technology, education, and weaponry, was able to easily capitalize and seize control. Meanwhile, locals, who did not stand a chance against the advanced weaponry at the time. When the dust settled, the white population owned all 13% of the entirety of the South African territory. And when capital started flowing into South Africa, the process of industrialization took a huge turn, and with it, the need to bring African people into the labor force. So with the evolution of the townships, with the discovery of precious minerals like gold, diamond, and coal, which was mostly in Witwatersrand, which is an area known in the Transvaal, which has Johannesburg as its industrial center, and also contained the richest gold deposits in the entire world, and huge opportunities for exploitation. But with the demand for labor to mine these newly discovered minerals could not actually be met, since it was a low-wage job and was incredibly dangerous. To be able to meet the demand, the administrators created a system of townships and homelands. This was to ensure that the competition from the native Africans against the Afrikaners was minimized by moving them from where they were to where they need to now move into. This was the law. The phenomena was coined as a dual economy. This results from the process where Western capitalists or colonialists disintegrate and destroy the pre-capitalist agrarian communities and keep them from evolving into a more modern economy by limiting the resources available to them, thereby creating two economies, the rich and the poor, with zero possibility of transitioning from one to another. In South Africa, this meant the two economies were separated by racial lines. White people lived within wealthy formal economy where the center of commerce were situated. The black townships were, and still are, located in the poor and informal economy that acts as a reservoir for cheap labor for the formal economy. In 1910, the central government introduced a system of land and hut taxes, which had to be paid in hard currency. Failure to do so meant expropriation from their homesteads and lands, and the only way that they could obtain hard currency was by working in the mines. It's important to note that they would employ workers in the mines as young as 15 years old. This is what the Xhosa people would call the Amajoyini, which in English could be loosely translated into the conscripted ones. To prevent the Amajoyini from competing directly with the white miners, for the better paying, less dangerous jobs, they were allowed to work on short-term 11-month contracts, which upon completion would be compelled to return to their homelands, spend the month there, and then kind of return and rinse and repeat the whole process. Laws such as the Native Labor Relations Act of 1911 were passed, which made it impossible for Africans to strike. And in 1923, the Urban Areas Act was passed, which systemized control over the geographical movement of Africans in the country. Under this law, all African adults had to walk around with a ID book with them, which were known as dompas at the time. This would govern where they could live, work, and travel. Failure to bring this with their dompas in the moment were arrested on the spot, and they would be forced into harsh labor in jail. There were 4 racial categories. There was white, Indian, colored, and African. Now, it's no surprise that up until 1994, with an estimated 44 million inhabitants in South Africa, white people comprised around 12.5% of the people, holding the majority share of all the resources within the country. The African majority, holding around 76.5% of the population, would hold the least amount of resources, with the second being the colored population of 8.5%, and then following that the third being the Indian population with 2.5%, also still holding more resources than what was available to the African population at the time. To ensure competitive threat to white domination was minimized, the apartheid government often, after 1948 enforced laws to restrict the other 3 races, and education, especially for Africans, was deliberately designed to deprive them from any specific and scientific knowledge that would prepare them to help contribute to the growing economy. This was articulated in an infamous policy statement that the Minister of Affairs said, and I quote, "There is no place for the Bantu," which, if you don't know, is African people, "in the European community above the level of certain levels of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot be used in practice? That is quite absurd. Education must train people in accordance with their opportunities in life according to the sphere in which they live." End quote. This malmanagement of resource allocation was evident when we can see that for every dollar spent on a African child, $10 were spent from the South African government on a white child. Now, there are 3 key features of townships. So the government was the one in control of the development in the townships, and there were 3 key features that was incorporated in the layout and design of these said townships. So the first feature was special separation. So they wanted to make sure that the township was as far away as possible from a white residential area. With this, a sophisticated railroad infrastructure was created to be able to facilitate transportation of taxis, buses, and trains between to and from work. This would also help facilitate the curfews that were set during apartheid to be able to have them arrive on time when they're supposed to and be out of there when they're supposed to. Because the law was that at 6 p.m. There were no Africans that were allowed to be on the street at the time. So the second feature was the total containment of the black townships. What this means is that they only created one exit and one entry point into these townships. This would help facilitate in case there were any uprisings, wars, riots, strikes, anything of the such would be able to be easily controlled and contained by holding these choke points down and allowing the military to swoop in and deal with the issue at the present point in time. The third feature of the township design was the alignment strategy. This means that from a bird's eye view, the townships were perfectly aligned so that if there was ever any breakout of war, one swift aerial attack would be able to cause as much damage as deemed possible to control the situation and ensure that because of the geographical location from the first key feature having them being separated from the white community, they would make sure that with an aerial attack, whatever damage that was done would not affect the white economy. Now, with the change over time, even though South Africa has changed drastically since the days of apartheid and the harsh conditions that the non-white population had to go through during apartheid is over, this still hasn't changed too much of the people that are still dwelling inside the townships. Why? Because even with government intervention that they have helped create programs of small marketplaces, opportunities, and provide electricity, fresh and accessible water, they have been stuck in the township since the days of apartheid and have been unable to escape the township. And that with the lack of education that was received, they are at the point now where the unemployment rates are still at an astronomical high, as well as crime rates also being incredibly through the roof. To close it out, I can still say that even after 30 years later as a South African, you can still see tensions in certain regions, or people would wish for apartheid in some shape or form to be reinstated, depending on which side of the spectrum you're looking through. You will see certain people that for their own personal reasons would want to have some form of apartheid, whether it be Africans being pushed back into townships, or where Africans would highly favor Afrikaans moving into their own townships so that they can have a taste of their own medicine. These types of tensions don't go away quickly and will still take time. Fortunately for us, we had Nelson Mandela being a huge inspiration, and unfortunately, with all the corruption that is going on in South Africa, it's not likely that anytime soon these types of tensions will die down. Until we can get another president that is as high-moraled as Nelson Mandela once was, I personally believe the corruption, the racism, and the tension will be sticking around, not be in all of South Africa, but in certain regions that is not going to change.